Have you been thinking about the flu season? Are you worried about its impact on your life this year? Will there be enough flu vaccine for everyone, or will you be left out in the cold like last year because it was a shortage that was unexplained? And what about the dreaded bird flu, the avian influenza virus that threatens us from the Far East? What impact will it have on us here in Lynbrook? Well, tune into Channel 20, our new series, Just Ask the Doctor, and we will address questions about influenza and all its aspects, as well as the implications of the dreaded bird flu. I think it's important, before we start talking about influenza itself, that you understand what influenza is. Influenza is actually a virus. And to understand what a virus is, we can go back to basic biology to separate or to clarify the differences between a bacteria and a virus. Now, to give you some sense of how important that difference is, a virus is a conglomeration of nuclear material. It does not have a cell wall, it does not have any cytoplasm. A bacteria, on the other hand, is much larger. And the analogy that I frequently use is that if you took a virus that was a collection of small little, let's say, basketball-sized particles and arranged them on the desk, a bacteria might be 100 times larger because it has the cell wall, like the walls around this room, filled with cytoplasm, which is a fluid that encases the nuclear material. Now, the reason why that's important to understand is that the virus, and in our case, influenza virus, does its damage by attacking the cell wall, making an entrance into the cell itself, reproducing itself, then destroying the cell and being able to escape the cell wall. The other reason why that's important is we want to do away with the misconception that the correct treatment for influenza is an antibiotic. Antibiotics generally that we use work by disrupting or destroying the cell wall. And since viruses don't have a cell wall, the common antibiotics that we use for bacterial infections just don't work. There are other appropriate treatments, and we'll talk about that later, but at least you need to understand that just because you have a bad cough or you have other symptoms, that getting penicillin or some other common antibiotic is not going to be the treatment of choice. Now, what makes the influenza virus very specific is the coating, the wall around the nuclear material. There are what we call antigenic pieces, or antigens. And though there are a number that we would consider in talking about influenza, the two that are most important are called the H antigen and the N antigen. H standing for hyaluronidase, N standing for neuraminidase. Very fancy words, but simple in concept. And the reason you need to know that is because many of you have been watching about influenza on the national press, and they talk about the H5N1 virus. H stands for the hyaluronidase, N for the neuraminidase, and they're the different types of those very specific antigens. Now, how do you identify an influenza virus? It's identified by one of its subgroupings, influenza A, influenza B, and influenza C. Most of our concern is with influenza A because influenza A tends to be the one that changes every single year. Remember that viruses are living material, they reproduce, and as such can adapt themselves to the environment. That's why we need to get a new flu shot every year. The flu shot from the year before is ineffective because influenza, as it adapts to the local environment, will change, and it becomes more adept to attack its victims, you and I, and cause more damage. Now, what does the influenza virus do to us that makes it so destructive? It usually enters the body through small little droplets that are conveyed from a person who has the disease to someone who does not have the disease. Most commonly through the nasal structures, as we breathe in through our mouth and throat, or as we touch ourselves, having communicated with someone else who has saliva or respiratory type material on their skin. For example, being very polite and covering your mouth puts the virus on the surface of your skin, shaking hands with someone else, or having direct contact will spread the virus from one person to another. So how does one know they have influenza? Well, the common symptoms are fever, headache, cough, runny nose, muscle ache, and you just feel terrible. It's so precise that many patients will come in and say, "Doc, it was 10 o'clock last night. All of a sudden I broke out into a sweat. I started to cough. My muscles started to ache. My back was killing me. My legs were sore. I went to bed. It just was awful. I was miserable. I was just so sick." That speaks to the fact that it only takes 4 to 6 hours for the influenza virus, once it enters the body, to attack a respiratory cell, enter that cell, and begin its process of destruction and moving on forward. How long do these symptoms last? Generally 3 to 5 days. Reason being that in those 3 to 5 days, the body mounts its own defense immune system to stop the replication of the virus, and once it stops that replication and prevents its progression, it inactivates the virus and eliminates it from the body, and then we recover. It is true that the more inoculum, the more virion particles that enter the body, the worse the symptoms are, and perhaps the longer the symptom complex will persist. There have been people that have had influenza for as much as a week or more. And then there is a phenomenon known as post-infectious asthenia, which refers to the body's breakdown. It just tends not to recover very quickly from such a huge onslaught of influenza virions, and people can be really weak and fatigued and feel terrible for up to 2 weeks after the acute infection. Now, how do we treat this particular virus? Well, the best offense, as they say, is a good defense. And the defense for us, in terms of influenza virus, is getting inoculated or vaccinated against influenza A. Is there enough flu vaccine? I can tell you unequivocally at the time of this filming that there is enough vaccine available. It may not have been available at the time in which you were ready to receive the vaccine because there was an inequality in the distribution of the vaccine. 3 different companies made the injectable vaccine, and 2 of those companies were prepared and distributed their product very early on. The third was licensed late and consequently distributed their product late, and as a consequence, many of us physicians did not receive an adequate supply in order to vaccinate our patients in a timely fashion. Fortunately, the flu season is not overwhelming to this date, but it does not mean that because we've moved into the new year that it's no longer necessary to get a flu shot. Influenza can be a very destructive force for our health up till February and even March. So it's advisable that if you're in the category of people that are at higher risk, please still get a flu shot. Now, what about those people? I mean, why do we single out certain individuals or certain groups of individuals to be targeted as the best candidates for being inoculated? Well, it's because influenza A virus is a respiratory virus. So people with chronic respiratory conditions or chronic cardiac conditions are at risk for severe disease. And in point of fact, 38,000 people a year, give or take, die from influenza virus or the complications of influenza virus. And most of those are pneumonia or some kind of cardiac complication. So people who have asthma, who have emphysema, people who have chronic cardiac conditions, particularly people with mitral valve disease, are at greater risk for succumbing to influenza virus. People who are elderly, people over the age of 65, people with other chronic illnesses that put a strain on the immune system, such as diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, other metabolic diseases, anything of a chronic nature that make it more difficult to survive that very short but maybe very disturbing period of time when you're attacked by the influenza virus, are advised to be vaccinated. Now, let's talk a bit about the vaccine. How's the vaccine made? How in the heck do we know what to protect ourselves against? In order to understand that, what you need to know is that the World Health Organization has a worldwide surveillance program where people watch influenza viruses. Sounds exciting, doesn't it? They watch influenza viruses year-round and identify where they originate and what their pattern of flow is. There are two technical phrases that I'll just throw in here that you don't really need to know, but the antigens that we talked about, neuraminidase and hyaluronidase, those antigens undergo what's called antigenic drift or antigenic shift. In other words, they can adapt to the environment and change so that they can become more destructive or more virulent. And depending upon that antigenic drift or shift, the virus may be more dangerous in the coming year than what we anticipated. So there are people who watch this, and they make computer models to predict which specific viruses will attack which parts of the world. The World Health Organization convenes a meeting in March of every year where they accumulate all this data, and they make a decision. Well, our government, the NIH, makes a decision as to which 3 or 4 influenza A viruses or which influenza B virus are going to be the most common and the most dangerous for the coming year. And as again, to refresh your memory from our initial discussion, these viruses are identified by the type of their antigenic coat, the type of their hyaluronidase, H antigen, or the type of their neuraminidase, or N antigen. So that a virus may be an H1N1, an H2N2, or the dreaded H5N1 virus. And then once agreement is made as to which viruses are going to be incorporated into the vaccine, the NIH or the federal government licenses companies to produce that particular strain of virus. And once they're licensed, they go into production. They make the virus, they take the virus and inject it into a chicken embryo. The virus is grown in that embryo, and once it's reached maturity, it's extracted, it's refined, and it's put into a form in which it's packaged or bottled and sent to various distribution centers for us or for health agencies to give to the patients.
We're fortunate to have with us today the Commissioner of Health for Nassau County, Dr. David Akman. Dr. David Akman has been in this position since the year 2001 and is no stranger to protecting the public's health. He, after graduating from Columbia University with a master's in public health, he served terms with the Center for Disease Control, New York State Department of Health Epidemiological Investigation Unit, and New York City. So, Dr. Akman, do you have a sense of what the flu season is going to be like this year? Any indications if it'll be a good season, bad season?
We never know what the flu season's going to be like. It's impossible to predict. We only know that every year the flu virus arrives in this country and in this region sometime in the late fall, usually between late October and early December. And most people, if they're going to come down with the flu, come down with it between November and end of January, beginning of February. But there's no way to tell whether it's going to be a bad flu season or a mild flu season.
When we talk about the flu, we talk about flu shots. What's the situation? Are there going to be enough, is there going to be a sufficient supply of flu shots for this season? There have been some indications that there's a shortage. Why is it that every year we seem to have this shortage, and what's your read on this?
We expect that there's going to be enough vaccine for everyone who wants to be vaccinated this year. The problems that we had last year with one of the major manufacturers, Chiron, will not be present this year. And Chiron has received licensure and is starting to ship their vaccine. But what we may see is spot shortages for short periods of time because of the peculiarities and idiosyncrasies of the distribution chain. But if you're patient, if your doctor doesn't have it this week, they'll have it next week. And if your doctor doesn't have it, there are other places to be vaccinated. Many supermarkets, department stores, pharmacies hold vaccination clinics. And if you have Medicare or if you have other insurance, they'll take your insurance and you can get vaccinated there.
Now, what about people who have the misfortune of not being able to get a shot right away? Is there an end point? In other words, if people haven't received a vaccine by the middle of December or late December, is it still good to be vaccinated?
We think it's important to be vaccinated, and obviously it's best to be vaccinated before the flu arrives in this region. But even if you're a little bit late in getting vaccinated, the vaccine will benefit you. So, but I think this year in particular, there shouldn't be any problem in getting vaccinated by mid-December. I think everyone who wants to be vaccinated will be vaccinated by that time.
From your point of view, what would you tell our viewers about prevention? What do you think the most important issues are, and what should we look for to make sure we don't get the flu?
Well, the most important part of preventing influenza is getting vaccinated, and particularly those people who are at greatest risk for the serious complications of influenza. That is the elderly, people with other serious medical conditions like congestive heart failure or chronic obstructive lung disease, the very young, and pregnant women. But we've also said that the flu vaccine can help anyone who wants to reduce their chances of getting the flu or having a severe case of flu will benefit from the flu vaccine. Beyond vaccine, simple hygiene is your next best thing. Hand washing, particularly if you're in a home with someone with influenza. But beyond that, there's really not much you can do. That's why vaccine is so important.
People don't need antibiotics for the flu.
That's correct.
There are other antimicrobials, and it's been in the press recently. Is any sense about supply or shortages of these?
Well, the most widely marketed anti-flu medication is a medication called Tamiflu. Tamiflu works if you use it very early in the course of your illness. But if you've been ill for several days, Tamiflu really doesn't make a difference. Tamiflu is particularly effective when used in places like nursing homes or in hospitals. There's some concern that if we really needed a lot of Tamiflu, we wouldn't have it. But as I've said before, our major strategy in reducing illness and death from flu is vaccine, and for vaccine we should have enough this year.
What about side effects from the flu shot? Well, the side effects generally are local. Some people can get a little irritation, a little swelling or burning. One of the most important things you have to tell the doctor when you're getting the flu shot is whether or not you're allergic to eggs. Reason being that the influenza virus is cultivated in chick embryo material, and so there's chicken material in the vaccine, and if you're allergic, you could get a violent allergic reaction. But we tend not to give people who are allergic to eggs the vaccine. People can, however, get some mild systemic effects in the 24 hours or so after the vaccine is given. You may get a little muscle ache, you may get a low-grade fever, you may just feel a little chill, you may feel some malaise, you may feel a little tired, but these are all reactions caused by the body's response to the injection of a foreign protein. These are not influenza symptoms or symptoms of you getting the influenza disease. And so it'll last a day or so and just disappear. So please have no fear about getting the flu when you get a flu vaccine. That's really an old wives' tale, but propagated by many who just probably are just afraid of needles and don't want to get the vaccine. Now, let's move on to the last topic, because one big question that's circulated in our communities is the dreaded avian influenza or the dreaded bird flu. what are we talking about when we talk about the bird flu? Well, remember we talked about identifying strains as an H1N1 strain or an H1N2 strain. Those are the most common strains that have circulated in our community over the past 5 years. The dreaded strain is an H5N1 virus, and this H1N1 influenza virus has been found mostly in Southeast Asia. Now, to date, there's been very minimal transmission from bird to man. It's been identified in individuals. Probably about 160 people have contracted the virus in Southeast Asia, and to this date, at least the date of this airing, 65 people have died. But they've all been in Thailand, in Cambodia, in Indonesia, all in Southeast Asia. The disease itself has not spread out of that portion of the world, and the governments in those portions of the world have taken big steps to try to eliminate spread of the virus by destroying chickens in most of those countries. The virus in the bird itself has been found and tracked as far west as Great Britain, Turkey, the western provinces of Uzbekistan. But so far, there's been no evidence that the bird flu in its form, animal form, has made its way to the United States. Now, what is it that we're worried about? Well, we're worried about the fact that in one fell swoop, a human being will be injected or will be exposed or contract the bird flu from an animal and an influenza strain from a human strain, and that in the period of time, as we explained before, how the viruses invade the respiratory cell, that there's a crossover of genetic material, which then when that particular strain extrudes or it breaks out of the cell, is an entirely new strain. And that new strain, since there's no antibodies that exist anywhere in the world, will be able to travel very rapidly through a local population, through a more expanded population, and then throughout the world. And given the pattern of the way people travel and the way birds migrate, this could spread throughout the world in a matter of weeks, even months. And from the time that first genetic exchange takes place, we could have a worldwide pandemic in as short amount of time as 3 or 4 months. And that's what's got people worried.
The first thing is that there has been no isolation of avian influenza, as you call it, the bird flu, anywhere in North America. It's been found in Southeast Asia, more recently in Europe, but it has not appeared anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. Even in Southeast Asia, there have been very few cases of people getting sick with this virus. It's in a region where there are over 1 billion people. There have been only about 150 cases of people getting sick with this virus. This virus easily infects birds. It does not easily infect people. In fact, it's very rare that it infects people. So at this point, we have no concern about an immediate threat from this virus. What we do have concern about, and this is shared by public health authorities throughout the world, is that this virus could somehow change, and instead of being easily passed from bird to bird, that it becomes infectious for people as well. And that's when we would start to worry, and that's why actually the president today is announcing a national effort to prepare for avian influenza. There's no imminent threat from avian influenza, but it's also impossible to predict when a pandemic strain might appear. That's why we're taking precautions now, both in terms of developing plans for what we would do should a severe pandemic occur, but also I think that's the president's intent today is to start on a research and also vaccine production program that would give us at least a little bit more breathing room, that would allow us to get full vaccine production in year if this occurs. Again, the basic need should a pandemic strain occur would be to have an effective vaccine. That would make a difference. The problem is, since we don't know what this strain will look like, it's impossible or it's unlikely that we'll have an effective vaccine produced before that it makes itself known, if you will. Well, the avian influenza, there's a lot of good information on avian influenza. It's available at the CDC website. It's available at the Nassau County Department of Health website. I think the web is going to be a terrific source of information on this. But if there is a true emergency, if we are faced with a pandemic strain of influenza, then there will be information also through our press office, through the county press office, through the state health department. There's going to be, I think it will be very clear to the general population what they need to do and what the government is prepared to do should that occur.
Now, just so that you're aware of this, at least from common medical readings, what we know is that the National Institutes of Health has experimented with a vaccine and has in truth figured out a way to make a vaccine by taking a normal strain and an H5N1 viral strain and doing precisely what I explained to you that may happen in a susceptible individual in the laboratory, so that they take 2 of these 6 segments out of an H5N1 virus, combine it with a normal regular influenza strain, produce the new strain, then they inject that into a chick embryo inoculum or an area to grow that, and then once they do all this genetic manipulation, they have a new virus, and they can take that virus, attenuate it or constrict it so it doesn't replicate itself, and then inject that into human beings, and we have a vaccine for the bird flu. That I'm aware of, at least at this point in our discussion, a lot of experimentation is done. There's been experimentation at 4 major medical centers in the United States, and about 2 million doses of this experimental vaccine are available. The problem is twofold. One is that we're not exactly sure what form this H5N1 virus is going to take, so we don't have the actual real virus to insert into this system to make a vaccine that's entirely useful. Second of all, is one of the rate limiting steps to all of this is that we grow this, or we cultivate this virus in a chicken embryo, so that really one of the rate limiting steps of this whole process is the availability of chicken eggs. Thanks for tuning in today. All you have to do is ask the doctor. And this has been your opportunity to just ask me if the opportunity does not present itself to ask your physician or health provider at some other point.